The courtroom buzzed with quiet laughter, a symphony of scoffs and smirks that danced through the air. Judge Barrow leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a knowing grin. His voice dripped with condescension as he peered over his glasses at the elderly couple standing before him. "This," he chuckled, motioning toward them, "is the most ridiculous case I've ever seen." A few jury members exchanged amused glances, and even the prosecutor let out a short, dismissive laugh under his breath. The atmosphere reeked of certainty that this frail old couple, these two relics of a forgotten past, stood no chance. Henry Thornton adjusted his sagging suspenders, his bony fingers idly tapping against his cane. Beside him, Margaret clasped her hands, her thick glasses magnifying the warmth in her sharp brown eyes. They looked harmless, helpless, like they had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. Judge Barrow sighed, rubbing his temple as if he had already wasted too much time. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly, exaggerating every word as though speaking to children. "You, an old man with a cane, and your wife, who looks like she just stepped out of a knitting club, actually believe you can defend yourselves against one of the most ruthless attorneys in the city?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom, a wave of mockery swelling in the air. "You should have hired a real lawyer," the judge continued, shaking his head. "This isn't a game of checkers at the senior center. This is a real courtroom with real stakes." The laughter grew, feeding off itself. The prosecutor folded his arms, watching the scene unfold like it was entertainment. Henry let out a slow, measured sigh. Then, as if he had all the time in the world, he raised his head and looked Judge Barrow directly in the eye. His lips curled ever so slightly, his voice calm and steady. "Oh, Your Honor," he said softly. "You really shouldn't have said that." Margaret smiled sweetly, adjusting her glasses. "Yes, dear," she murmured. "He really shouldn't have." The laughter faded. Something about the way they spoke, so sure, so effortless, sucked the air out of the room. The smirk on Judge Barrow's face twitched, just for a second. The prosecutor's arms loosened, his confidence flickering. And in that silence, for the first time, a whisper of doubt crept into the courtroom. The scent of fresh brewed tea lingered in the warm evening air as Henry and Margaret Thornton sat on the porch of their modest suburban home. The sun dipped low, casting streaks of gold and orange across the sky. A light breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment everything was just as it should be, peaceful, quiet, simple. Henry leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "You ever think about the old days, Maggie?" Margaret smiled, her fingers wrapped around her teacup. "Every day, dear. There was a time when they weren't just an elderly couple enjoying their golden years, a time when their names carried weight in courtrooms, when their sharp minds tore through legal arguments like a hot knife through butter. They had built their reputations from nothing, had fought battles no one else dared to take on. But those days were long gone. They had left that life behind for something simpler, something quieter, at least until trouble found them. A sharp knock at the door shattered the serenity. Margaret set her cup down and moved to answer, her steps steady but cautious. A single envelope rested on the doormat. No return address, no indication of what lay inside. Just cold, stark white against the warm wooden floor. She adjusted her glasses, unfolded the letter, and began to read. Her breath hitched. "Henry," she whispered, her voice uncharacteristically tense. He took the paper from her hands, scanning the words, his grip tightening with each line. Their home, the place they had spent decades building, was under attack. A powerful real estate company had found a loophole, a technicality buried deep within pages of legal jargon, and they were using it to take everything. their house, their land, their peace. Margaret's voice was quiet, but firm. They're trying to force us out. Henry let out a slow breath, rubbing his forehead. This isn't right. It's not just about us, Margaret said, her gaze sharp. If they can do this to us, they can do it to anyone. And at the center of it all stood Richard Calloway. He was a name Henry knew well, one of the most ruthless attorneys in the city. A man who didn't just win cases, but buried his opponents so deep they never resurfaced. Henry had gone toe-to-toe with Calloway years ago, and the man hadn't changed. If anything, he had only grown more dangerous, more connected. And now, Calloway was coming for them. Margaret watched her husband carefully. We should fight it, she said simply. Henry shook his head. Maggie, we're old. We left that life behind. Margaret smirked. That doesn't mean we forgot how to win. The problem wasn't just the lawsuit. It was the system. The company had deep pockets, endless resources. Hiring a lawyer would be nearly impossible, and any attorney willing to take their case would be steamrolled by Calloway's connections. Henry sighed. This is going to be a mess. Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Then let's make it a beautiful mess. And just like that, the game was back on. The quiet of their home was replaced by a familiar chaos. The dining table, once a place for warm meals and casual conversation, was now buried beneath stacks of legal documents, case files, and sticky notes crammed with hurried scribbles. The walls, once decorated with family photos and reminders for grocery lists, were now lined with printouts, legal loopholes, and a strategy map so intricate it could have belonged to a high-stakes war room. Margaret adjusted her glasses, scanning through an old case ruling with a practiced eye. This judge has a pattern, she muttered. He favors procedural efficiency over ethics. If we can show that Calloway's case is an abuse of process, we might be able to force his hand. Henry, flipping through zoning laws and property statutes, let out a low chuckle. I forgot how good it feels to outthink a snake. For the first time in years, their minds were sharper, their focus relentless. The rust of retirement was burning away, replaced by the adrenaline that had once driven them through courtroom battles against the biggest corporate sharks. Margaret smirked, tapping a document with her pen. Remember the Simmons case? That real estate developer who tried to bulldoze an entire neighborhood? Henry grinned. Took him apart in deposition before he even made it to trial. Margaret nodded. Because we found the one clause in his contract that contradicted his own argument. This is no different. Henry exhaled, rubbing his temple. Except for the part where we're representing ourselves against one of the best attorneys in the city, in front of a judge who already thinks we're a joke. Margaret leaned back, her smile unwavering. Then we just have to make sure they never see it coming. The days leading up to the trial blurred into a whirlwind of research, late-night strategizing, and carefully constructed arguments. Every potential counter-move, every trick Calloway might pull was dissected and neutralized before it even had a chance to surface. And then, the day arrived. The courthouse was buzzing when they walked in, a sea of suits and briefcases, whispers and stolen glances following their every step. Calloway sat at his table, exuding the smug confidence of a man who had already won. He barely glanced up, didn't even acknowledge them as he flipped through his notes. The jury members exchanged amused looks, already convinced of the outcome before a single word had been spoken. Judge Barrow sighed as they took their seats. Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, just to confirm, you are representing yourselves? Margaret nodded, smoothing her cardigan. Yes, Your Honor. A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd. Calloway leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. This was going to be easy. At least that's what they all thought. Henry shot a glance at Margaret, and she met his eyes with quiet certainty. They weren't just here to fight. They were here to win. The courtroom settled into a steady rhythm of murmured conversations and shuffled papers as the trial officially began. Richard Calloway, poised and polished, rose from his seat, straightening his expensive suit as he stepped toward the jury with a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "this case is, quite frankly, a waste of the court's time." He turned slightly, motioning toward Henry and Margaret as though they were nothing more than a footnote in his story. "We have here an elderly couple, confused, overwhelmed, clearly out of their depth, attempting to navigate a legal battle against professionals who understand the law." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the audience. The judge remained passive, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. "They are, of course, good people," Calloway continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "But they are not lawyers, and this, Your Honor, is not a senior centerboard game. This is a courtroom." He turned back to the jury, his voice lowering as if to drive home the simplicity of his argument. "Contracts were signed, agreements were made. My client followed every legal protocol, and now the Thorntons are simply having second thoughts. This is not a case of injustice, but of regret." Margaret remained still, hands folded neatly in her lap. Henry exhaled slowly, adjusting his cane, as Calloway confidently strolled back to his seat, nodding at the judge as though he had just sealed the case in record time. Judge Barrow leaned forward. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton, your response." Henry didn't rise immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, considering. Then, without hurry, he pushed himself up, gripping his cane as he made his way toward the center of the courtroom. For a long moment, he just stood there, studying the jury, the judge, the prosecution table. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying an old wisdom that felt entirely out of place in a room that had already written him off. "You know," Henry said, tapping his fingers against his cane, "people used to laugh at me in court too. Thought I was nothing to worry about." Margaret adjusted her glasses. They never laughed for long. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had vanished. Judge Barrow frowned. "Excuse me?" Henry reached into his pocket. The small action sent a ripple through the room, as though everyone had collectively leaned in, waiting. His fingers worked deftly, unfolding a neatly pressed document. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the exact legal precedent that proves our case is not only valid, but that this entire lawsuit should never have been allowed in the first place." The prosecutor shifted in his seat. Calloway's smirk faltered. "Preposterous," he scoffed, shaking his head. "That's nothing but an old man grasping at straws." Henry didn't even look at him. He simply stepped forward, handing the paper to the court clerk. The silence was thick as it traveled to the judge's bench. Judge Barrow took the document, adjusting his glasses as he began to read. His smirk was gone within seconds. His frown deepened. His posture stiffened. The room waited. Then, finally, the judge exhaled, his fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. He looked up, this time not with amusement, but with something closer to disbelief. "Where did you get this?" Margaret, still seated, smiled sweetly. "We wrote it." A murmur spread through the crowd. The jury sat up straighter. Calloway clenched his jaw. Judge Barrow cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. "Well, that changes things." A hush fell over the courtroom, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in like a slow, creeping tide. Judge Barrow, who had been so sure of his verdict minutes ago, now stared at them as if seeing them for the first time. "You wrote this?" he repeated, his voice quieter now, lacking its earlier condescension. Henry straightened, slipping his hands into his pockets with the casual ease of a man who had stood in this exact position too many times before. "That's right, Your Honor. My wife and I, we weren't always retired. Once upon a time, we were two of the most feared attorneys in this city." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The jury exchanged stunned glances. The quiet whispers turned into full-blown murmurs as the weight of their revelation settled over the room. Judge Barrow blinked, his gaze flicking between them as if trying to place long-forgotten names to the familiar faces. "You're lying," Calloway snapped, his voice sharper than before, his confidence cracking like thin ice beneath too much weight. Margaret tilted her head. "Are we—" Henry turned to Calloway, his expression calm, almost amused. "Tell me, Mr. Calloway, when you were fresh out of law school, when you were still cutting your teeth in the legal world, did you ever hear about a couple of attorneys who made a name for themselves by taking down the biggest firms in the city?" Calloway opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. His jaw tightened, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides. Because of course, he had heard of them. Henry and Margaret Thornton, notorious for dismantling corporate giants, masters of finding loopholes, exploiting weaknesses, turning hopeless cases into historic victories. They had been legends, and now they were standing in front of him, smiling like they had already won. The courtroom was no longer laughing. Calloway clenched his jaw. "It doesn't matter," he snapped, forcing his voice back into its usual cool confidence. "Maybe you were big shots once. That doesn't change the fact that you signed a legally binding contract. This case isn't about who you used to be. It's about the facts." Margaret adjusted her glasses. "You're right, Mr. Calloway. It is about the facts." She leaned forward slightly. "And the fact is, we know exactly how to take you apart, piece by piece." Calloway's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Judge Barrow sighed, rubbing his temples as though trying to process the sudden shift in his courtroom. "We're going to take a recess," he announced, tapping his gavel. "Court will reconvene in 1 hour." But the moment Henry and Margaret stepped into the hallway, they were met with chaos. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in their faces, reporters scrambled to get closer, their voices overlapping in a frantic chorus of questions. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, is it true you were once the top attorneys in the city? Why didn't you reveal your identities sooner? Are you planning a comeback after this case?" Margaret smiled politely, holding up a hand. "No comments for now, dears. We're still in court after all." Henry chuckled, adjusting his suspenders. Wouldn't want to break any rules. The reporters fired more questions, but Henry and Margaret simply walked past, their heads held high. Calloway, lingering near the courthouse entrance, watched them go with narrowed eyes. His fists clenched. This case was no longer about paperwork, no longer about contracts. This was a war. And for the first time, Richard Calloway wasn't sure he was going to win. The courtroom doors swung open and the buzz of reporters faded as Henry and Margaret stepped back inside. The break had done little to calm the storm brewing in Calloway's eyes. He sat at his table, gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was preparing to strike. As Judge Barrow took his seat, Calloway stood, straightening his tie with the poise of a man who had just found his ace in the hole. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, measured, "before we proceed, I'd like to call attention to an interesting fact about the plaintiffs that they conveniently failed to mention." Henry leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming lightly against his cane. "Here it comes." Calloway turned to the jury, pausing just long enough to let the weight of his words settle before delivering his blow. "Their son, Jonathan Thornton, is one of the most powerful corporate lawyers in the country," he said, letting a slow smirk creep onto his face. "A man who has built his career defending firms like the one his parents are fighting against today." A murmur spread through the courtroom. A few jurors glanced at each other. This was unexpected. Margaret's expression didn't change, but Henry caught the way she pushed her glasses up, a small tell, one she had whenever something irritated her. "Tell me, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton," Calloway continued, his tone laced with mock curiosity. "How does it feel knowing your own son has spent years defending the very corporations you claim to despise?" The jury shifted. The audience whispered. Calloway had set the perfect trap, frame them as hypocrites, paint them as bitter retirees looking for one last fight. Silence stretched. Then, a voice broke through the tension. "You know, Mr. Calloway," Jonathan Thornton said, rising from the back of the courtroom, "I wasn't planning on speaking today." All heads turned. Jonathan, sharp-suited and composed, made his way toward the front of the courtroom. He moved with the confidence of a man who had stood in front of powerful judges and walked away victorious. He wasn't just Henry and Margaret's son. He was a force in his own right. Calloway smirked. Well, well, the prodigal son. Jonathan adjusted his cufflinks. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I know exactly who my parents are." He turned, locking eyes with Henry and Margaret, and smiled. "They are the two smartest people I've ever met," he said, his tone unwavering. "They are also the most relentless, stubborn, and cunning legal minds this courtroom has ever seen." A ripple of energy moved through the room. Henry raised an eyebrow, fighting back a grin. Calloway's smirk wavered. Jonathan turned back to him, eyes gleaming. "And you," he continued, voice growing sharper, "you made a mistake today." Calloway tilted his head slightly. "Oh? And what mistake is that?" Jonathan leaned in just enough for his words to hit like a hammer. "You assumed I wasn't on their side." The reaction was immediate. The jury sat up straighter. The quiet murmurs of the crowd turned into a wave of excitement. Calloway's face darkened, his smirk wiped clean. Judge Barrow sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Oh, for the love of... Do I even need to ask where this is going?" Jonathan grinned. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally assist in my parents' legal defense." Calloway inhaled sharply, fists clenching at his sides. Henry exhaled, finally allowing the smallest of smirks to slip through. He glanced at Margaret, who simply gave him a knowing look. A family united. And now, Calloway wasn't facing two legendary attorneys. He was facing three. The courtroom was no longer a stage for laughter and mockery. The air had shifted, the energy now crackling with tension. What had once seemed like a routine case, an old couple stubbornly fighting against the inevitable, had transformed into something far greater. Calloway knew it, the jury knew it, and most importantly, the judge knew it. Margaret rose from her seat, smoothing the front of her cardigan as she stepped toward the jury box with a practiced ease. "Mr. Calloway would like you to believe this is a simple contract dispute," she began, her voice steady, controlled. "That my husband and I are just two confused seniors who fail to read the fine print." She took a slow step forward, her sharp eyes scanning the faces before her. "But let me tell you what this case is really about," she continued. "This isn't about us. This is about the dozens, no, hundreds of elderly homeowners this company has targeted over the years. It's about a pattern of predatory behavior, about powerful corporations who bury legal traps in contracts, knowing full well that the people signing them won't have the resources to fight back." A few jurors exchanged glances. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder. Margaret reached into a neatly stacked pile of documents on their table, pulling out a thick manila folder. She held it up. "This," she said, "is a collection of complaints, testimonies, and case files, every single one involving this company, using the same loopholes, the same tactics, against people just like us." She turned, walking the folder over to the court clerk. "If Mr. Calloway would like to argue that this is just buyer's remorse, then I'd love to hear his explanation for all these cases." The folder was handed to Judge Barrow, who adjusted his glasses and flipped open the first page. His expression, already cautious, darkened with every line he read. Calloway's confidence wavered. Henry pushed himself up from his seat, his cane tapping against the floor as he made his way toward the center of the room. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but firm, "there's a reason my wife and I took this case on ourselves. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't about pride. It was about making sure that people like Richard Calloway's clients don't get to keep pulling the same dirty tricks and getting away with it." He gestured toward Calloway's table, his voice steady but pointed. "You ever notice how these corporations never target the wealthy? How they never go after the people who can afford the best lawyers?" Henry let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. "They don't pick fights with people who can fight back. They pick fights with the ones they think are weak." Calloway stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing but emotional theatrics." Judge Barrow held up a hand, silencing him. "I think I'll be the judge of that, Mr. Calloway," he said flatly. Then, turning back to Henry, he nodded. "Go on." Henry nodded once, glancing at Margaret, who gave him the faintest knowing smile. "Calloway's client wants this case thrown out, wants to pretend none of this matters, because if it moves forward, then we don't just win this case, we set a legal precedent that stops them from ever doing this again." Another murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the jury, once skeptical, now sat at the edge of their seats. Judge Barrow let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against the bench. Finally, he turned toward Calloway. "Mr. Calloway," he said, voice measured, "after reviewing this evidence, I'm not dismissing this case." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Calloway's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Judge Barrow sighed, closing the folder with a quiet thud. "You have the right to present a counter-argument, but be warned. You're no longer arguing against a confused old couple." He leaned forward slightly. "You're arguing against two of the sharpest legal minds this courtroom has ever seen." Silence. Then, for the first time since this trial began, Richard Calloway looked worried. The tension in the courtroom thickened like a storm cloud waiting to break. Calloway was losing his grip, and he knew it. But a man like him never entered a fight without a contingency plan. With a carefully measured breath, he straightened his tie and pushed back from the table, regaining his composure. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the plaintiffs have done a remarkable job painting my client as some kind of villain. But if we're going to talk about facts, then let's talk about facts." He turned toward the courtroom doors and gave a small nod. Doors swung open, and a woman in a sharply tailored suit strode in, her heels clicking against the floor with precise, deliberate steps. "Allow me to introduce Jennifer Ellis," Calloway announced, his smirk returning as she took the witness stand. "The legal director for my client's firm and one of the most respected attorneys in corporate law." Henry didn't move. Margaret barely blinked, but Jonathan, standing beside them, let out a low breath. "I know her," he murmured. "She's ruthless." Margaret's lips curled ever so slightly. "So are we." Calloway approached the stand, his voice calm, casual, too casual. "Miss Ellis, can you confirm whether the real estate company has ever engaged in unethical practices?" Jennifer clasped her hands neatly in front of her. Absolutely not, she said, her tone cool and unwavering. Calloway nodded approvingly. And what do you think of the allegations made by the Thorntons? Jennifer sighed, as if genuinely exasperated. It's a classic tactic, she said, shaking her head slightly. Seasoned lawyers using their experience to twist reality, exaggerate claims, and create drama to distract from the actual legal facts. The truth is, the contracts were legally sound, and the Thorntons are simply looking for an easy way out of their responsibilities. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway's smirk widened. Margaret inhaled slowly, then stood, adjusting her cardigan before making her way toward the witness stand. Miss Ellis, she said politely, you claim that no unethical behavior took place. That's correct, Jennifer replied without hesitation. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And you also claim that my husband and I are simply creating drama for sympathy. Jennifer tilted her head slightly. I believe the term is grandstanding. Margaret smiled, a smile so small, so precise, that only Henry recognized it for what it was. A warning. Well, Margaret said, reaching into the stack of papers on their table, then perhaps you can clarify something for us. She pulled out a folder, flipping it open before handing a set of documents to the court clerk. Your Honor, these are internal emails from the real estate firm, all bearing Jennifer Ellis's name, discussing how to pressure elderly homeowners into selling under misleading terms. Jennifer's carefully maintained composure wavered. The clerk handed the emails to the judge, who began reading through them, his expression growing darker with each line. Margaret folded her hands neatly. Would you like to revise your statement, Miss Ellis? Jennifer swallowed, her fingers tightening on the arms of the chair. Calloway stood quickly. Objection. This is taken out of context. Judge Barrow slammed his gavel against the bench. Enough, Mr. Calloway. Calloway flinched. The judge turned to Jennifer, his eyes narrowing. Miss Ellis, you just testified under oath that your company did not engage in unethical behavior. And yet, these emails suggest otherwise. Would you care to explain? Jennifer opened her mouth, closed it. Silence. The jury was no longer uncertain. Judge Barrow exhaled sharply, setting the emails aside. I've seen enough, he said, his voice laced with irritation. He turned toward Calloway, his patience officially gone. Mr. Calloway, you will have the chance to defend your case, but right now, your credibility is hanging by a thread. Calloway's smirk was gone. His hands were clenched into fists. Margaret stepped back toward her table, adjusting her glasses as she sat down beside Henry. That was fun, she murmured. Henry chuckled under his breath. He's unraveling. Calloway, for the first time in his career, looked like he knew it. The courtroom was silent. Tension coiled in the air, thick and unrelenting. Every eye was locked on the jury box as the foreman rose, a crisp sheet of paper clutched in his hands. Judge Barrow's voice cut through the stillness. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman gave a small nod. We have, Your Honor. Henry sat still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Margaret remained poised, her expression unreadable. Jonathan, standing beside them, exhaled slowly. Even Calloway, despite his well-practiced composure, had a flicker of unease in his eyes. The foreman cleared his throat. In the case of Thornton versus Willow Ridge Realty, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. The words hit like a hammer. A gasp rippled through the audience, followed by hushed whispers. The courtroom, once filled with quiet amusement at the helpless old couple, was now filled with stunned disbelief. Henry's hand found Margaret's beneath the table, and she squeezed it gently. Judge Barrow leaned forward, his voice firm. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, I am ordering an immediate review of Willow Ridge Realty's business practices, and I strongly advise that an independent investigation into potential fraudulent activity begins at once. The final blow. A quiet thud echoed as Calloway sank back into his chair, his face drained of color. His entire case had just imploded. Reporters bolted from their seats, already scrambling to get the breaking news out first. The Thorntons had won. But more than that, they had done something far worse than defeat Calloway. They had exposed an entire system of corruption. Jonathan turned to his parents, shaking his head with an incredulous smile. "You two never cease to amaze me." Margaret smirked. "We do have our moments." Henry exhaled, rubbing his chin. Something tells me this was the easy part. And he was right. Because just as they stepped into the courthouse hallway, Jonathan's phone buzzed. A message. No name, no number. Just 8 chilling words. The real fight has yet to begin. Jonathan's grip tightened around the phone. His pulse quickened. He glanced up, scanning the sea of reporters and court officials, searching for who? Then he saw him. A man in a dark coat, standing at the far end of the hallway. He wasn't holding a camera. He wasn't a reporter. He was just watching, waiting. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before the man turned and disappeared through the crowd. Jonathan swallowed hard. His parents had just won a case against Calloway. But this wasn't Calloway. This was something bigger. And whoever had just sent that message, they weren't finished with the Thorntons yet. The victory felt short-lived. The celebration, the relief, it all vanished the moment they stepped through the front door of their home. Margaret gasped. Papers were scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, bookshelves ransacked. Their once cozy living room now looked like the aftermath of a robbery. Henry's grip tightened around his cane as he scanned the damage. They were looking for something. Jonathan bent down, picking up a sheet of paper that had been left, not thrown, on the coffee table. The words, scrawled in bold, red ink, sent a cold chill down his spine. You should have walked away. A warning, or a promise. Margaret exhaled, steadying herself. We rattled the wrong people. Jonathan's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, expecting another cryptic text, but this time it was a call. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, low and smooth, crackled through the line. You're playing a very dangerous game, Mr. Thornton. Jonathan's heart pounded. He turned away from his parents, lowering his voice. Who is this? The voice chuckled softly. Someone who appreciates order. And you? You're disrupting it. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. If this is about the lawsuit, you lost. Get over it. A pause. Then, the lawsuit was never the problem. But you've pulled a thread, and if you keep pulling, you're not going to like what unravels. Jonathan swallowed hard. So, this is a threat? A small, amused exhale. Considerate advice. You're a smart man, Jonathan. Walk away, before you don't have a choice. Click. The line went dead. Jonathan stood frozen, the cold weight of the warning settling in his chest. Whoever this was, they weren't just trying to intimidate them. They were making it clear this wasn't over. Before he could say anything, the sound of a car pulling up outside caught his attention. He turned to the window just as Detective Simmons stepped out of an unmarked sedan. His expression was grim, his movements quick. He had heard. Moments later, Simmons stood in their ransacked living room, arms crossed as he listened to Jonathan recount the call. When Jonathan finished, the detective exhaled sharply. I was afraid of this, Simmons muttered. Henry narrowed his eyes. Afraid of what? Simmons hesitated, then pulled a file from inside his coat, tossing it onto the table. Jonathan flipped it open, scanning the contents. Newspaper clippings, corporate documents, financial records. One name stood out: Victor Langston. Jonathan looked up. Who is he? Simmons' jaw tightened. Billionaire, real estate mogul, and the man who really runs Willow Ridge Realty. Calloway was just a pawn. Langston, he owns the board. Margaret adjusted her glasses, studying the file. And let me guess, he doesn't take kindly to losing. Simmons nodded. He's untouchable. Money, power, connections. He's got his hands in everything. But you exposing Calloway? That put a crack in his foundation. And now? He's coming for you. Jonathan clenched his fists. The lawsuit, the threats, the break-in, it had never been about one case. This was a war, and Victor Langston had just declared it. The city erupted into chaos. It started with a single boom, distant but powerful. Then another, and another. Explosions, strategically placed, designed for panic, not destruction. Buildings shook, sirens wailed, emergency responders scrambled to contain the madness. Smoke curled into the sky, and within minutes the streets were flooded with terrified civilians. Jonathan's phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He answered before the screen even finished lighting up. It's Langston. Simmons's voice came through sharp and urgent. This isn't random. He's breaking himself out. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Where? The courthouse. The word sent a shockwave through him. He was already moving before Simmons could explain further. Margaret and Henry were right behind him, keeping pace as best they could. If he escapes now, we lose him for good, Simmons continued, his voice clipped over the line. I'll meet you there. The tires screeched as Jonathan gunned the car down the road, weaving through the chaos like a man possessed. Margaret, calm as ever, checked her watch. Langston planned this to the second. Henry grunted. Then let's ruin his schedule. They arrived at the courthouse to find absolute mayhem. Police officers scrambled, reporters yelled, civilians ran in every direction. The front doors had been blown open, the once imposing courthouse now a gaping wound in the middle of the city. Simmons met them at the steps, gun drawn, eyes scanning the crowd. He's not coming out the front. There's a transport tunnel underground, links to a secured lot for high-risk prisoners. Jonathan exhaled sharply. That's where they'll extract him. Simmons nodded. We need to move. Now. They sprinted through the debris-filled halls, dodging fallen beams and shattered glass. The air was thick with smoke, but their path was clear. Down. The underground corridors were eerily quiet compared to the chaos above. Dim, flickering lights lined the tunnel, casting long, shifting shadows along the damp walls. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Jonathan pressed himself against the wall, eyes locked on the far end of the tunnel. A black, armored van was idling near the exit. Langston. Two armed men stood outside the van, scanning the area. Inside, Jonathan could make out Langston's silhouette through the tinted windows. Simmons pulled out his gun, whispering, I can take the two guards. You get to the van. Before Jonathan could reply, Henry moved first. In one swift motion, he swung his cane hard, connecting with the nearest guard's knee. A sickening crack echoed in the tunnel as the man collapsed. Margaret followed without hesitation, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall and slamming it into the second guard's head. Jonathan didn't waste the opening. He ran. Langston had just pulled the van door open when Jonathan tackled him, sending both of them sprawling onto the concrete. Langston snarled, twisting free. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Jonathan clenched his jaw. I could say the same to you. Langston swung first. Jonathan ducked. The next blow caught him in the ribs, pain exploding through his side. But he didn't back down. With a sharp pivot, Jonathan grabbed Langston by the collar and slammed him against the van, hard. Langston coughed, dazed. His eyes flickered past Jonathan toward the exit. He still thought he could escape. Not today. Simmons appeared beside them, gun raised. "It's over, Langston." The billionaire sneered, chest rising and falling as he slowly lifted his hands. His cocky smirk returned, even as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "Impressive," he muttered. "But you're still playing checkers while I'm playing chess." Jonathan glared. "Then consider this checkmate." Langston chuckled darkly. "Oh, Thornton, the game isn't over." He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for only Jonathan to hear. "It's just beginning." Langston's smirk barely wavered as Jonathan tightened his grip on his collar, shoving him back against the van. The billionaire's breath was uneven, his suit slightly disheveled, but there was no fear in his eyes, only amusement, as if he still had cards left to play. Jonathan's knuckles ached, but he didn't let go. "You're done," he said, voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Langston exhaled a slow, measured breath. "Am I?" Jonathan felt it before he saw it. Langston's hand moving toward his pocket. Instinct took over. Before Langston could reach for whatever last trick he had up his sleeve, Jonathan threw a punch, landing it clean against his jaw. Langston staggered, caught completely off guard. His smirk, finally, vanished. Simmons was there in seconds, gun still trained, voice sharp. "Hands where I can see them, Langston." Langston, breathing heavily now, slowly lifted his hands. The sound of metal snapping shut echoed through the tunnel as Simmons locked the handcuffs around his wrists. The billionaire let out a slow, dry chuckle as he wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "You think this means anything?" he muttered. Jonathan, still catching his breath, stared him down. "It means you lost." Langston held his gaze, eyes gleaming with something dark. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, voice low, measured. "You think this ends with me? You think you've won?" Jonathan clenched his fists, but before he could respond, Langston leaned in slightly, his next words barely above a whisper. "The game never ends." Simmons pulled him away before he could say anything more, leading him toward the waiting officers. Langston didn't struggle, didn't fight. He simply smiled as they took him away. Jonathan watched as the man was loaded into the police convoy, sirens flashing, the sound of engines roaring to life filling the air. Henry stepped up beside him, gripping his cane. "He's bluffing," he said quietly. Jonathan let out a breath. "Maybe." Margaret, ever composed, simply smiled. "Then we'll just have to make sure he never plays again." Weeks passed. Langston's empire crumbled. His name was dragged through every headline, his connections exposed, his allies either arrested or running for cover. For the first time in years, the people who had suffered under his corruption saw justice. Jonathan sat at his desk, flipping through case files, phone calls pouring in from people who needed help. His parents had won their case, but this was so much bigger than just one victory. Margaret placed a fresh cup of tea on his desk, watching him carefully. "You're not going back to corporate law, are you?" Jonathan smiled, shaking his head. I think it's time I used what I know to fight people like Langston, not work for them." Margaret beamed. "That's our boy." Henry smirked. "Took you long enough." Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "You two could retire, actually enjoy some peace for once." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, then set the cup down neatly. "Oh, Jonathan, there's always someone out there who needs help." Henry leaned back in his chair, the smallest grin tugging at his lips. "And besides, where's the fun in retiring?" Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. His parents were something else. And as the sun set outside the window, painting the city in streaks of gold and orange, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more gripping tales of justice, power, and unexpected twists, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. What did you think of the Thorntons' incredible fight for justice? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And remember, the fight against corruption never ends. Stay sharp, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next one.